Good evening. If you've been bewildered by a blizzard of conflicting information about the COVID-19 pandemic over the past 12 months, you're not alone. Millions all over America and the world are right with you. On this episode of From the Stacks, James Agresti of JustFacts.com will help us distinguish things well understood from things not known at all or subject to highly justified debate about the pandemic and government's responses to it. Welcome. I'm glad to have you with us this evening on From the Stacks, the live stream of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. I'm Cal Beisner, the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance, and we are a network of evangelical Christian theologians, scientists, economists, and other scholars dedicated to educating the public and policymakers on biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the poor, and the gospel of Jesus Christ, together with the worldview, theology, and ethics that come along with that. We are a nonprofit organization supported by the gifts of donors like yourself and others around the country and around the world. As a matter of fact, every month we try to offer an important educational resource to our donors as our way of saying thanks when they make a donation of any size. This month, we are offering a wonderful new study called Fix America's Forests: Reforms to Restore National Forest and Tackle the Wildfire Crisis by Holly Fretwell and Jonathan Wood of the Property and Environment Research Center, who will be our guests next week. To receive your copy, simply go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, in the comments field, write in promo code 21-05 or fix the America's Forests, and we'll be glad to send that to you. Holly and Jonathan, the authors of that study, will be our guests next week on From the Stacks, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy that program as well. Well, now let me introduce tonight's guest to you, and I will tell you this introduction is going to be a little bit longer than usual because James Agresti of Just Facts, or JustFacts.com, is a rather unusual person, and he's somebody that for whom I have tremendous respect. In fact, I'll give you one example that just arose about 15 or 20 minutes ago as to why I respect him so much. The New York Times just ran an article earlier today that indicates that the CDC may have been reporting far too high a rate at which COVID-19 is spread outside. I asked Jim before we went live if he would be willing to talk about that a little bit, and his answer was a firm no, that he would not do that without first being able to check all of the sources used by the article and make sure that the article had not misrepresented what actually has happened. That is a tremendous display of integrity, and I want you to have the same respect that I have for James Agresti. He is president and co-founder of Just Facts, has 2 decades of experience in evidence-based public policy research and analysis. His work has been cited by a broad range of media outlets, academic institutions and publications, and PhD scholars. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Brown University, and he uses his background in the physical sciences to apply practical, empirical approaches to the often capricious world of public policy. Just Facts is a nonprofit institute dedicated to publishing comprehensive, straightforward, and rigorously documented facts about public policy issues. To accomplish this with objectivity and excellence, Just Facts uses exacting standards of credibility to determine what constitutes a fact and what does not. The vision of Just Facts is to equip people with facts that empower them to make truly informed decisions about important matters. And this requires proven facts that accurately and fully convey reality, not pseudo-facts, not half-truths, not talking points. JustFacts.com has been cited by media across the conservative liberal spectrum, from CBS and PBS to the Wall Street Journal and Investors Business Daily, to Psychology Today, Roll Call, Yahoo News, CNBC, Forbes, and by educational institutions like Pepperdine University, Rice, West Virginia, Vanderbilt, University of Texas, and many others, plus academic publishers like Gale Cengage Learning, Encyclopedia Britannica, Prager, Rutledge, Elsevier Health Services, McGraw-Hill, and the various federal and state governments, us, the Cornwall Alliance. Just Facts applies rigorous standards of credibility to all its work, which is Agresti. Jim, well, thank you so much for joining us this evening in evidence-based fact-finding. It was related somehow to a book you wrote about the reliability of the Bible, right?
Correct. Just came from an idea from my brother Tom, who in the 1990s got into following public policy, politics, and he would call and talk to me about different issues. And every time he asked a question or made a comment, I always threw a fact back at him. So he purchased the name JustFacts.com. The internet was in its infancy then. And I put some facts up. And one of the things I wanted to do in that book was document it in a way that someone very skeptical but yet open-minded about Christianity would see that everything I was saying was in fact accurate. So I developed standard documentation and a way of going about research that was very rigorous for that book. And when I completed that book, I went back to Just Facts and started applying what I learned there to the realm of public policy.
And I've read most of that book that you wrote about the factuality of the Bible, Jim, and I think it's excellent. Really, really an excellent book. Well, excuse me.
Thank you for your kind words.
Your website, Jim, lists 7 standards of credibility to adhere rigorously to everything you teach. What are those, and why are they so important?
Sure. So the principle I was just alluding to, the things that I learned writing, and basically coming at, I was just alluding to the things that I learned writing, and basically coming at this from a standpoint of an engineer that was skeptical and needed proof of the scientific facts of the thing I was working on in order to make them properly. You know, in the world of public policy, and to a degree, in the world, bad impacts of accepting something that's false are not always immediately apparent. But when you were designing jet engines, as I was, if you do something wrong, a plane can fall out of the sky. So I wanted to bring that kind of rigor, means having a full picture of all the relevant facts. You know, one of the most common ways the media and politicians and partisans mislead people is by giving them half the truth. And half the truth can sometimes amount to a total lie. If the conclusion you draw based on that half-truth, you would draw a different one if you had more facts, more truth. We have 7 of these standards. Another was just looking at primary sources, digging back to that original source to make sure that the people along the way didn't misinterpret what that source says. And after doing this for many years, I can tell you this is commonplace in the media, it's commonplace in academia, it's commonplace in peer-reviewed journals, which are supposed to be the ultimate authority when it comes to scientific facts. It's just widespread. So all of these standards we put in place to ensure integrity. I could go on listing them all and talk about them for hours on end, but I'd like to say this.
I don't think
Within the next month, God willing, we are going to be launching a new initiative called Just Facts Academy, which
Hmm.
teaches people how to use these standards to sort out truth from fiction and to become a very competent researcher. So it's going to be a video-based initiative. It's very entertaining and fun, but it will give particularly high school and college students the ability to apply these things in their research and produce excellent quality research that will get cited by PhD scholars if they apply this standard.
That sounds fantastic. How can people learn more about that? It seems to me that that would be a tremendous opportunity for homeschoolers, but for others as well. Where do they go to get more information about how to participate?
So if you go to justfacts.com and just put your email into our sign up for updates, we will notify you of that when it comes out. We will not inundate you. By the way, we send an average of about one email a week, and we never give those emails to anybody. It's always for internal purposes. We don't put people, sell our emails for mailing lists, but you will be notified of that. And as we produce new videos and other content, you'll be made.
I have just lost sound.
Oh, okay, can you hear me?
Now, there we go. Got you back.
Okay, all right.
Okay. So, all right. Sorry about that. So let's dive into the topic for this evening, which is, well, SARS-CoV-2 or the novel coronavirus and COVID-19, the disease that it causes. This has been a really controversial subject, and it and governments' responses to it have brought upheaval to literally billions of lives all around the world. There are all kinds of competing fact claims about it. Some are readily justiciable by solid empirical evidence, some remain in considerable doubt, and some just lack all credibility. Our aim tonight is to communicate some of the most important solid facts and give a little guidance on how to think about some of the others. We're working off of your lengthy report on the subject on your website, Jim. First posted back in December and have updated several times since. Most recently, well, I had thought about a week ago, you told me now that you update it every single week. So last time was just 4 days ago. So first, Jim, would you summarize off the top of your head, what are some of the most important facts we really know about the virus and the disease itself?
Sure. So, one of the most important facts, and something that was a topic of debate from the outset, and something that the vast bulk of the media got wrong, as well as the World Health Organization, is the fatality rate. Originally, people were measuring the number of reported cases and then saying, well, this is how many deaths are associated with the disease, and dividing it by the number of reported cases, with the assumption that if the case wasn't reported, nobody had the disease because they would know if they had it. But what we found out over time, and what Trump had said from the beginning, as well as some of his senior staff, like his Surgeon General, had said, no, this is not the way to look at this. There are a lot of unreported cases. There are a lot of people who have this with no symptoms or very little. And he said, after this 3.4% figure was published last March by the World Health Organization, and media outlets went crazy, holy cow, this is a massive fatality rate. And Fauci said, oh, it's 10 times more than the flu. Trump said, no, it's not. It's well under 1%. And what the peer-reviewed facts of this matter have proven is Trump was 100% correct. It's somewhere around 3% to 0.3% to 0.4% or 0.2%, depending upon the source. We have on our website a bunch of them listed, straight links to the sources, whether it's the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford University, or prestigious medical journals, they're all settling in at about that point. And in fact, even the World Health Organization has come around recently and said they published an article in their Bulletin of the World Health Organization saying, hey, this is somewhere around 0.3%. So the clamor, the panic, everything that went with the initial stage of the lockdowns was based on an abject falsehood that the fatality rate was much higher than it actually was.
Okay. And so, what are also some of the most common counterfactuals about it? Misunderstandings that are widespread in the public, but clearly contrary to the facts. And you've just mentioned one, obviously, and that's the fatality rate. But what would be some other counterfactuals about this? Widespread ideas, but they just simply don't have factual basis.
Absolutely. So this is one that has been rampant from the beginning and still has not been totally fixed to this day. A lot of the misinformation at the beginning has been refuted, and I think many people have come around on it, including some organizations that now have egg on their face, like the World Health Organization. But there's one they haven't come around on so much, and that is the ability of the virus to mutate. Now, let me be clear. All viruses mutate. It happens. But people confuse COVID-19 with the general family of viruses that it's a part of called coronaviruses, as is well known by now. And viruses tend to mutate very rapidly. And what a biomedical journal published back in March of 2020, again, you can find the link in the article right off the homepage of our website. They looked at the genome of this and they said, hey, the part of the virus that causes it to be so infectious, it's the spike protein. People have been using that word. They're familiarized with it that at this point. It's the spikes that you see in the visual representations of the virus. The genetic code for that, the RNA, has a proofreading mechanism in it. And that is very, very rare for a coronavirus. And that proofreading mechanism limits the amount of mutations or the scale of mutations that this virus will typically undergo. See, and what happened from the start is they were saying, well, if you catch this thing, I'm not sure you're going to be immune to it a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, 20 years from now. And as they've data has come in, what they found is that the level of immunity you get from catching this disease is comparable with the highest levels of vaccine efficacies. Now, immunity is never 100% because your immune system, it's got to operate, right? If you have a compromised immune system, yes, you can catch this thing 100 times. There was a patient actually who had the disease for 9 months because they would give him therapeutics, he would get better, and then it would come back because his immune system just couldn't handle it. But what all this means, the implications of this, is that if you catch the disease, odds are, it's not proven, we won't know till 50 years from now. Odds are you're immune for the rest of your life. I'm not talking 100%, I'm talking a very high percentage of people. The same goes for vaccines. Now, the vaccines at this point are not as robust as natural immunity, but for the most part, all this fear about variants not working against certain vaccines have proven unfounded, with one exception, which is the J&J vaccine. We can go on a whole aside with that, but there's a reason for that, okay? But the Pfizer, the RNA vaccines have proven to be very effective against the variants. And the places you're hearing, oh, we are having this horrible outbreak because of this variant. I want you to look at those places and ask yourself, are they places that lock down hard? And they all are. You don't hear about the Texas variant, right? You don't hear about the Florida variant. You're hearing about it in places that locked down hard and did not give their population a chance to develop herd immunity. And the moment the lockdown was lifted to a degree, the disease spread. It's very contagious. That's one of the dangerous aspects of this virus. It's much more contagious than the flu. But if you look at the variants, they'll say, oh, the UK variant. locked down hard. The South African variant, locked down hard. The Indian variant that's going on right now, locked down hard. Now, the data in India, this is interesting. We're hearing about this horror show, and there are bad things happening there right now. But if you look at the portion of India's population that have been killed by this disease compared to the US population, it's 1/10. In other words, their COVID-19 death rate is 1/10 that of the United States. So it's spreading now because they eased down their lockdowns. And this was something I wrote back in March. Unless you develop this vaccine very quickly, the moment you ease these lockdowns, this disease is going to come roaring back. And when they were saying, oh, 15 days to control the spread, I was writing saying, no, that is not how this works. And I don't need specific data on COVID-19 to know this because it wasn't available then. You just have to look at any contagious disease. You have to look at the measles, you have to look at influenza, you look at the variables in terms of transmissibility, and you can see this is going to spread because we knew the transmissibility back then.
Okay, so finally, before we go farther on this, I'd also like you to try to address what would be some of the factual questions for which we still really don't have solid answers, but nobody seems to be acknowledging that we don't have solid answers. And these would be important things, not just sort of minor things off at the circumference, at the periphery, but I guess they'd be called known unknowns. What are those in this case?
You know, I think for the most part, most of what needs to be known is already known. It's already been published in a peer-reviewed journal. It's just being ignored. That's my view of it. And a lot of this stuff was known way back when, but politics and egos being what they are, some people just didn't want to acknowledge them, or maybe just weren't thorough. They were not comprehensive. They operated out of fear. To me, there's not a lot that's not known. I've seen data on almost every controversial issue, whether it's hydroxychloroquine, whether it's the vaccines, whether it's masks. Yeah, there are error bands, right, that we can tighten up over time as we get more data in. But I think the big truth, the big picture things are known. Actually, something just occurred to me. I think the story has not yet been settled as to the origin of this disease. I have not seen hard data that proves conclusively one way or another whether this happened naturally or was born in a lab. And I'm not saying it was done intentionally. It could be done quite innocently and by mistake and have leaked out.
Okay, I need to apologize to you, Jim, and to all of our listeners. I have just put my laptop back into business, having had it out for repairs. And there are a number of different things where things are not working quite the way they used to be. And I've kind of clumsied around here a little bit. I hope that I've now got things under control. So let's go on here. Clearly, one of the most important issues is the fatality rate of COVID-19. Jim, in your article, you break that down by age group like this. 0.03% for people aged 0 to 19 years, 0.02% for people aged 20 to 49 years, 0.5% for people aged 50 to 69 years, and 5.4% for people aged 70 plus years. Now, most of us aren't accustomed to thinking in terms of fractions of a percent. So for every million people in each age group who get COVID-19, how many would we expect to die, Jim?
Sure. So I should say, by the way, that these figures come from the CDC. And I think it was a September or November report. And they've been confirmed by other studies since then, particularly the one for 70-year-olds. Most people think if you get this at the age of 70, man, you have a huge chance of dying from this. That is simply not the case. Now, let me just, this is not to play this down. If there were 1 in 20 chance, which is what 5.4% equals, of dying if you stepped out your door today, you probably wouldn't go out, right? You don't want to play those odds. They're high odds. But getting back to your question now. So if you're 0 to 19 years old, for every million people who catch this, about 30 will die. If you're in the age range of 20 to 49, about 200 out of a million will die. If you're in the 50 to 69 year age, about 5,000 will die. And 70 above, you're looking at about 54,000 out of every million who catch this disease are going to die. So they're appreciable, but particularly for the younger groups, there are much higher risks of dying from many other things that we don't shut down schools from, we don't mask children up for, we don't shut down playgrounds. You can never bring the risk of anything to zero, but yet you have some politicians that are, locking down people, interfering with their freedoms and their choices, while saying, well, I'm going to do this if we can save just one life. And that's an admirable thing, but you have to look at the cost. What is the cost of telling a child, hey, you're not allowed outside? What is the cost of telling a worker, you can't work in your job? We'll give you money to sit home and laze at home. They're not developing skills. Alcohol and drug consumption are through the roof. So you just can't say, well, if it saves one lives, you have to count. You need that negative number in there. Well, how many lives is it going to cost to take this action? We have in the 2020, 6 times more children died of pneumonia than COVID-19. We didn't lock them out of school to save one life from pneumonia or from car accidents and all these things that are unfortunately the hazards of life in this fallen world.
Yeah, and my understanding, Jim, is that actually ordinary influenza is, what would we say? It's more of an equal opportunity killer than COVID-19 is. That the death rates from that are much more even, not totally even, but much more even across the age span than for COVID-19. Even very young people are killed at a higher rate by ordinary flu than by COVID. Um, is that correct?
That is correct. And I'm not sure it's still there, but I checked a couple months ago and the CDC had a statement essentially saying exact what you said, that, hey, the flu is a greater risk for children than COVID-19. One of the
Yeah.
unique aspects of this that was not known at first is the age profile at which people get hurt. And that, by the way, as we're talking here, that's something else that hasn't been figured. Why is the fatality rate so different, the profile for COVID-19 than the flu? At first, people were saying, well, of course, children, their immune systems are stronger, and this explains it, but that doesn't explain it. There is something very different here, and there's 3 prevailing theories. It would take a while to go into them, but I don't think it's been settled exactly why children have such a high degree of resistance to this and why older, sickly people are so vulnerable to it.
Okay. Again, my friends, I would remind you that during the month of May, the Cornwall Alliance would be delighted to send a new study called Fix America's Forests as our way of saying thank you when you make a 100% tax deductible donation of literally any size and request this. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, in the comments field, simply write in Fix America's Forests or promo code 51-04, and we will gladly send you a copy of this as our way of saying thank you for when you make that donation. Okay, Jim, early in your article, you introduce what I consider a really important distinction: deaths versus years of life loss. Uh, Explain that distinction for our viewers.
Sure. So this is something that's gotten lost in this whole coverage, which is the fact that people eventually die. It sounds simple enough, but there's a big difference between an ailment that kills somebody a week before they would die otherwise and something that kills a 20-year-old who may have lived for another 60, 70 years. This does not devalue the life of older people. It just accounts for the fact that, hey, man cannot extend life indefinitely. Only God can do that. And he does it in a spiritual sense, not in a physical one, at least at this point in juncture in time. So we have to come to grips with the fact that this age profile of this disease makes it less deadly by the measure that the CDC has always used when in the past, when looking at pandemics and diseases and other things that take lives in an untimely manner, which is the years of life lost. You just can't say, well, COVID took 577,000 lives, and the Vietnam War took, I forget the exact figure, I think it's in the $70,000 range, 70,000 people range, excuse me. There's a big difference between people being shot down in the prime of their lives and people in nursing homes who lived a week or a month later. Doesn't mean one is more important than the other, but it means the burden of the disease, the harm of it, is much worse if it's younger people. And this is the exact opposite case with COVID-19.
Yeah, in fact, we're seeing, many times more lost years of life for younger people with things like influenza or suicide or automobile accidents and various other things. We're seeing lost years of life for them from COVID. It is a significant difference. And all of this reminds me of something that I try to help people to understand, and that is we never save a life. Never. We may buy time. We may increase the length of a life somewhat, but we never save a life. Every one of us dies. It is appointed to everyone once to die, and after that, the judgment, says the Epistle to the Hebrews. And so if we understand that, then we realize that we're not trying to put a dollar sign on a life. Instead, when we ask, is it worth this to extend a life by so much? We're asking the value of time. And that's a very different thing from asking the value of a life. Well, Jim, because COVID-19 is far more deadly for older people than for younger ones, the years of life lost from COVID-19 is likely to be well below the years of life lost from other hazards that don't vary so much by age. Can you rehearse some of the basic facts about that for us, assuming total American population at the start of 2020 of about, say, 331 million people?
Sure. So if 1 million people in the United States ultimately die from COVID-19, and I think that is a very high number, that is really a worst case scenario, particularly given how quickly the vaccines were developed and the drop off we're seeing right now in the number of deaths and cases. I think that is highly unlikely. I think we're going to reach herd immunity very quickly, and we already have in some places. If it takes 1 million lives under that nightmare scenario, given the average age of people that they're dying of COVID-19 have died and how old they tend to be, it will steal about 13.2 million years of life from all Americans who were alive at the outset of this pandemic. In comparison, the flu, which comes back every year and is very difficult to vaccinate against, because it does mutate very rapidly. Now, a new flu vaccine has to be developed every year. Even then, it's not super effective in many cases. But just given the current rates, the flu is going to steal about 35 million years of life from everyone who was alive when this started. Suicides are going to take 132 million years, and accidents are going to take more than 400 million years. So again, I get back to that rhetorical question. Why don't we shut down the whole economy, ban everyone from driving cars and going on ladders and everything that's associated with accidents, to save a life. We don't do that because we destroy lives if we were to do that. And the same thing has happened with the reaction, I would argue, overreactions to COVID-19. We have hurt people. This is not a matter of trading dollars for lives. It's a matter of trading lives for lives.
Okay, now in your article, you also address the average age of death from COVID-19 compared with the average age of death from all causes combined in the United States. And I found that a little bit ironic. What are the facts on that, Jim?
So the average age of somebody who has died of COVID-19 in the United States is 75 years old. By the way, everything I'm saying here is directly from a credible primary source. That particular data comes from the Centers for Disease Control, the death certificate data published by the NCHS. All I did is take all those ages and average them together. And you can see that in a spreadsheet that's linked to the article. It's all documented to the hilt, just as our standards require. The average lifespan for somebody in the United States at birth is 79 years. Now, this is something you might do quick math in your head and say, okay, you live to an average of 75, at 79, and people are dying at 75. COVID is stealing an average of 4 years of life from people. But it's not that simple. And this is why. If you're 75 years old, your expected life expectancy isn't 79. That's your life expectancy at birth. Okay, some people die along the way. So as you get older, your expected life expectancy is longer. So I use this data to calculate that COVID is stealing an average of 13.2 years of life based on average life expectancy for the various ages at which it's killed people. Now, this is important. I am not accounting for pre-existing conditions. The actual figure, and I make this clear, is much lower than that. It's not taking 13 years of life on average from people. In fact, one journal has it as low as around 2 years of life. But we don't have exact figures just yet. But the point is, it's the average person who dies from this is 75 years old. Now, I have parents that are older than that. I am not minimizing that. In fact, when I first published this, my mother, who proofreads my articles for typos, said, I'm a little uneasy with what you're saying here. And I said, yeah, I understand that. But here's the reality. Like you said, you cannot extend life indefinitely. And you do have to look at who's being killed and the actions that you take too. If you say, you know what, I'm going to lock down these school kids. I'm not going to let them outside. I'm not going to let them in school. How many of them are you going to kill by this? And I'm not just talking about killed this year, because one of the worst lingering effects of this is anxiety and depression, which if you're young, typically doesn't kill you when you have it. It takes years of life off the end of your life. So 50 years from now, you may die young because you had a heart condition or high blood pressure that was triggered earlier in life due to this episode of high anxiety or depression that you had when you were 20 years old. Or maybe you're 45 and all of a sudden you're not working and you're worried about the future. And by the way, there is hard data on this by like the Kaiser Family Foundation. Depression, anxiety have been increased drastically during this pandemic. And a lot of it, I would argue, unnecessarily because of the media coverage of it and the way governments have dealt with it. They are not counting that. But scholars are counting it. They're looking at it and publishing figures, and the death toll is greater than that of COVID-19. The reaction, the cure is, in fact, going to be worse than the disease, but they're never going to admit to it. They're going to be, it's lingering effects of COVID 20 years from now, but really it's what they did to deal with it that has hurt these people.
Yeah, actually, I think it was March of last year, I wrote an article on Cornwall Alliance's website. I think it was titled, How Many Uninfected People Will the Lockdowns or will the response to COVID-19 kill? And as I look at some interesting economic studies on the impact, for example, of joblessness on death rates, it really looks to me like it's quite probable that the increased death from the massive unemployment that followed the lockdowns, that is likely to overwhelm the death rate from COVID itself. In other words, we're not doing a good trade-off there. We're losing more lives and more years of life because of the responses to COVID than from COVID itself. You mentioned in your article that some of the measures to limit the spread of COVID-19 sometimes involve fatal trade-offs, and thus overreactions can destroy more years of life than they save. You've mentioned anxiety. I've just mentioned job loss, which can contribute to anxiety, to drug use, overdose, to suicide, and the like. Are there some others that also contribute to rising death rates at ages all along the spectrum beyond those?
There's a massive amount of different variables that is going to happen, and it has happened already, and it's going to continue to happen. One of the most common is missed medical care.
Yeah.
I can tell a story about a friend, and the data backs this up. It's happened on a major scale. He did not receive proper medical care because he went to the doctor, wasn't feeling well. The doctor asked him, "Have you had a COVID test?" And he said, "Yeah." And he said, "What were the results?" He said, "I'm waiting on him." And the doctor said, "Well, wait till they're come in and then come back and see me." The doctor was like, I don't want to see you until we resolve." And he died. He died from a diabetic coma, which really was the issue, that went untreated even though he went to the doctor. There's delayed cancer treatments. The New England Journal of Medicine had a study on how many more people have died from heart disease and all these other ailments because they were afraid to go to the doctor. Or a lot of hospitals stopped doing what they called, I forget the exact term, but not time-sensitive procedures. Guess what? Cancer screenings are time-sensitive. You delay that, you let the cancer fester for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, your survival rate drops way down. There are just so many ways in which the reactions to this were ill-informed and hurt people. Cal, one of the things, most wise statements I've ever heard, I heard from an MIT physicist by the name of Victor Weisskopf. And he said this: an expert is somebody who knows more and more about less and less until finally he knows everything about nothing. And this refers to the tendency of scholars that have a very high degree of competence in a very narrow discipline to not see outside of that discipline. Hey, if you're an immunologist, that's all you're looking at. You're not looking at the effects of unemployment. You're not looking at the psychological effects of anxiety. You're not looking at missed cancer screenings. You're just thinking, we have to slow the spread. We have to slow the spread. Repeat after me, slow the spread. They're not looking at all the consequences of what that entails. So this is something that, unfortunately, a lot of very smart people fall into. It's something that a famed economist once called fatal conceit. Although he used it in a slightly different context, it's the same general human foible to think because you're smart about this one thing, you know everything, and none of us does.
Yeah, I've always thought from the very beginning that it was a huge mistake for the coronavirus task force under President Trump and as it continues under President Biden to consist almost exclusively of medical experts because there are so many more facets to this than just the medical facets. There are the psychological facets, there are the sociological facets, there are the legal facets, there are the the economic facets. A good response team on this, I think, should have had a wide cross section of scholars able to represent the various different fields that would have insight into this. And had we had that from the start, I believe we would never have had the lockdowns. We would probably never have had the mandatory mask orders that we've had. And consequently, without the lockdowns, we wouldn't have had the enormous decline in employment. We wouldn't have had the elimination, the destruction of millions and millions of businesses around this country. We wouldn't have lost the billions or the trillions of dollars of lost economic production over the time, as well as we wouldn't have had any reason to spend the now going on some $5 trillion in coronavirus stimulus spending and relief spending and things of that sort. So this problem of the tyranny of the experts is made even worse when what we get is the tyranny of experts all from one discipline, not bringing in the expertise of people of other disciplines as well. So I'm right with you there, Jim. Now, as of May 6, last week, the CDC estimated that, quote, confirmed and probable, unquote, deaths in America from COVID-19 over the past 15 months had amounted to about 577,000, very slightly over that. But earlier, last year, around September, I believe it was, or might have been August, the CDC reported that only about 6% of deaths reported as from COVID were of people who were not either aged 70 or above or had comorbidities, and the average person dying with COVID had 3 comorbidities. Many of these people might have died just from those comorbidities, even if they'd never gotten COVID-19 within a fairly short period of time. Now, if you apply 6% to the 577,000, the result would be just 34,622, which we could say they died with COVID-19 and with no other plausible cause of death. That's actually fewer than the average number who die from flu each year. And this is for 15 months, not 12 months, the period used to define the average flu fatalities per year. Even if we doubled that, it would be fewer than die from flu in a particularly bad year. Well, what does this tell us about the comparative fatality of COVID-19 and flu?
I would argue it doesn't tell us much, and this is why. When that 6% figure came out, I did what I always do, which is I went to the primary source, I looked at that CDC report, and I said, this is not clear the way it's phrased. It was being reported as pretty much as you were saying it. You know, it's an accurate summation of how it was widely reported. The problem is that the CDC report was vague on whether or not the COVID-19 was the underlying cause. In other words, somebody had diabetes, but COVID-19 really hastened their death, or diabetes was the underlying cause, and COVID-19 was a small contributing factor. So after digging through that data, I couldn't resolve it. I said, I don't have the answer here. So I did what our standards of credibility called for. I dug a little deeper and I wrote to the CDC. And I said, hey, look, I did some homework on death certificates. I want to know if COVID-19 appears in Part A or Part B, or Part 1 or Part 2. Death certificates are divided into 2 different groups. Is it a contributing factor or a primary driver? And they said, hey, we don't have this data, but this is the data we do have. And the data we do have is this. COVID-19 in 92% of all cases where it's listed on a death certificate is listed as the primary contributing cause. So it's not that Um, People had, they were just about to die from diabetes, and COVID-19 pushed it forward by a day or two. Now, that happens, don't get me wrong. It's just not the
Hmm.
vast bulk of these. So it has chopped off time, an appreciable amount of time, off the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. It is more deadly than the flu because it's more transmissible, number one. And number two, the death rate is higher. It's not 10 times higher, like Fauci said. It's about 2 or 3 times higher. But you mix up that high transmissibility with the higher death rate. And I do believe those numbers, while probably exaggerated, aren't that far off in terms of the toll this has had, particularly on elderly people.
Well, that's a significant and appreciated correction to my own understanding of that CDC report from back in August. Appreciate your helping me out on that.
I'd
You
be
also
happy to send
argue
you
in
the
your
email too.
article.
So you can look at it. I'd be happy to send you the email.
No,
You know, I'm not
I'd love to see
infallible,
that.
but that's the way I read it, and I feel strongly about it. But you know, we all make errors, but that's what I
Yeah.
think the facts show.
Well, thank you. And yeah, go ahead and send that to me. I'd love to read that. Now, in your article, you argue that it's unlikely that COVID-19 will continue to take as many lives in future years as it has in the past, because it's very vulnerable to antibody neutralization and has very limited ability to mutate. Now, you referred a bit to the massive increase in COVID-19 deaths going on in India right now, and you pointed out that that wasn't so much a matter of a new strain, but rather that the Indians had used very rigorous lockdowns that prevented the building up of herd immunity and of immune resistance. But you also refer to here the fact that COVID is very vulnerable to antibody neutralization. Can you explain that aspect for us?
Sure. So this goes back to that biomedical journal paper published back in March that I referenced earlier. So the scientists who looked at this looked at the genome, also looked at the spike protein, and said this thing is the kind of thing an antibody can easily attack. Um, the physical structure of the way an antibody neutralizes a virus is it's kind of like a lock and key situation. It fits onto something, and if it's a match, if the lock isn't bent and the key aren't bent, it can neutralize. It can interfere with the functions of the virus and effectively neuter it and eventually kill it. And when this scientists in this journal looked at this, they said this is not AIDS. In fact, this is the words they used. They said AIDS is a genius, meaning the virus itself is very crafty at evading the human immune system. This is very vulnerable. And again, this is one of those things that's been proven out. At the outset of this, there were estimates for vaccines that ran about 3 to 4 years before we would have one. I read a paper saying we have not developed a good vaccine in over 10 years for anything. And one of the reasons multiple companies were able to develop them very quickly is this is easily neutralized by antibodies. So it
Hmm.
makes it a disease that can be fought as opposed to something like AIDS that if you get it, you're stuck with it forever for the most part, right? Herpes is another
Hmm.
one, right? These diseases,
Yeah.
you keep them forever. This is not the case here. So it made it easy to develop that vaccine. It makes our immune systems really good at fighting it once we got it. Something interesting I read. So there was a study done about 10 years ago on the 1918 influenza pandemic. And they took people who were born a few years before then and who got that flu when they were children. And they took out their blood and they analyzed it and they found that the people still had immunity to the bug from 90 years earlier, right? When they did this
Yeah.
study. Not only that, they were able to take the blood and use it to build what's the therapy that President Trump had? Mononuclear antibodies. And they were actually able to create them from this 90-year-old incident from before, put them in mice and inject the mice with the flu, and the mice were able to fight it off and live. So
Hmm.
if they're not mutating rapidly and they're vulnerable to antibody neutralization, it's a lot easier to fight them. They don't tend to take lives year after year after year. We don't become immune to
Hmm.
the flu. We don't become immune to accidents. Um, these things just happen time and time and time again.
I've been one of many people who've felt a little skeptical about the vaccines because the length of the period of testing has been much shorter for the COVID vaccines than for most vaccines that we've done in the past. What you just said suggests to me that the trial period could be significantly shorter for this and yet achieve pretty sound results despite that limited period of time. Am I inferring properly from what you've said?
I think that is a logical deduction. I have not seen that explicitly said in what I would call, a high-level medical journal. It's something that I arrived at the same conclusion, and something I predicted in writing back in March in an article about
Hmm.
this. So it has turned out that way. Now, that said, Cal, these vaccines were developed very quickly, and I do think in time they're going to develop the vaccines that have higher efficacy, that they're going to be
Hmm.
better than 95%. They're going to be much better.
Hmm.
They're going to be resistant on a higher level to all the different variants, but it's going to take
Hmm.
time. So again, this is one of those things where you have to weigh the pros and the cons. Hey, if we didn't develop this quickly, how many more people would die if we didn't do it? So it's
Hmm.
it's really it's a hard choice. I once said to somebody about the president, almost every choice he or she makes, somebody's going to die. It's just a question of who. And to weigh
Yeah.
that is a very, very difficult thing because there's just so much that's unknown. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a logical deduction. We were able to do it because the virus is vulnerable.
I'm going to ask you to step out of your normal character for a moment here. You normally just work with such total attention to the empirical realities, the measurable facts, and so on. Um, I'm just curious. Have you already had, or do you plan to have one of the COVID vaccines that are on the market
Yes,
now?
I'm double vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine.
Huh.
Um, I had a very slight reaction to the second dose. Just felt kind of lousy for an hour or two. Took a nap and then slept it off, and it felt great. One of the
Huh.
concerns about the vaccine is that, hey, you're fine now, but a year from now, you're going to drop over dead. And, we're not going to know that from a year from now because it's a risk. I looked at my age profile, the risk of me dying from COVID-19, and I looked at, the possible risks from the vaccine as we know them today. And I said, this looks like a very clear choice for me, that it's a lower risk to go this way. But this is one of the unique facts about toxicity and long term damages. And it only applies to cancer, technically, but it's something a lot of people don't realize. If something has a low immediate toxicity, there's almost a linear relationship between that and its potential for long time carcinogenity or the chances of it giving you cancer. You can see the documentation for this if you go to our homepage at justfacts.com, click on pollution, and at the very outset of that section, you'll see the basis of toxicology, and there's a bunch of documentation showing this. So we can't know with certainty. The vaccine is technically still experimental because the rule is you have to go a certain amount of time to look for these long-term effects. But if you're not seeing short-term effects that are bad, odds are you're not going to get a lot of long-term effects that are bad. There's that relationship between them, at least when it comes to cancer.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to translate some of what you just said. You
Okay.
referred to, you said there's an almost linear relationship between short-term and long-term toxicity and I guess lethality. Um, and I think a lot of us are not accustomed to thinking in terms of linear relationships that way. Translate that for us.
So this is the bottom line. People don't realize this, but any substance can kill you. The base of toxicology is that the dose makes the poison. You can die from drinking too much coffee. You can die from drinking too much water. You can die from eating too much potatoes because they have a natural insecticide in them that is lethal at a certain dose. And what toxicology studies have found is that if a low dose or a high dose of something doesn't kill you right away, odds are it's not going to give you cancer over the long term. So obviously, there's a trade-off there. You're not going to get cancer right away from being exposed to a very harsh chemical, typically. But the dosage of that chemical, if it'll kill you at a low dose, it'll probably give you cancer. If it won't kill you at a high dose, it probably won't give you cancer. Does that make sense? Is that a little less technical?
Yeah, that helps. I'm still curious. Does this suggest that if the risk from a very low dose short term is very low, then if that low dose continues over a long period, the risk will still be low at any given point in that long period?
Now, we're using relative terms, but the answer to your question is, generally speaking, yes. That's the general
Okay.
rule of how toxicity plays out. So water is one of those things. You have to ingest a ton of it to have it kill you. Okay. Having a lot of water over the long term isn't going to give you cancer. Okay. Now we can go the opposite spectrum, uranium, right? Uranium is one of the most toxic substances known to mankind. And by the way, we all have some of it in our body. We all have
Yeah.
a certain degree of it in our body. It's extremely low dose, but a very low dose of that will kill you pretty quick. And an even lower dose of that over time is going to give you cancer. Okay. So there's this relationship between, is it dangerous to you now at a certain dose, and is it dangerous to you over the long term at a lower dose? Yes, that happens, but if it's the higher, the more you can take right now without dying, the less apt it is to hurt you over the long term. Does that make sense?
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Tell us about herd immunity. What does it mean? What is its likely level with regard to COVID-19? And how did you reach your conclusion that it could have been achieved with much less loss of life than actually occurred had public policy been different?
Sure. So herd immunity refers technically to the point where for every person who catches the disease, less than one person will catch it from them. And when you reach that point, the disease rapidly declines because it's an exponential thing, right? If less than one is getting it, it declines over time. The same thing if you have a very high transmissibility in a disease. Let's say the flu, which is probably around 1.3, and COVID, which is about 2 to 3, probably around 2.5 to 2.8. There's a massive difference in how fast it spreads because it's an exponential thing. Every time one person gives it to 2 or 3 people, it spreads very quickly. So herd immunity is the opposite of that when the disease rapidly drops off. Now, here's the interesting thing. We talked about lockdowns earlier. The seminal piece of research that was used to justify lockdowns all over the world, if you remember, it was very much talked about, was a model from the Imperial College of London that just showed absolutely catastrophic death tolls if we didn't lock down right away. Now, the problem is that when they looked at that model, for the most part, was the media and public health officials, it was an all or nothing thing. They didn't look at, well, what if we just did this and just did this? And we didn't do all of these lockdowns. So a study published by the British Medical Journal, I want to say about 6 months later, looked at that. And this is the interesting thing that they found. Had we not locked down children, had we not locked down schools, had we not had general societal lockdowns, less died, less years of life would have been lost than what we did, which is lock down everybody. Because for the most part, these people, young people who are healthy and rarely affected by this, much less so than other things, would have become immune to this and prevented the spread of it into elderly people who are very vulnerable to it. You can only lock down people for so long, and then boom, you get that person into the presence of granny and grandpa, and they can give it to them. If you lock down granny and grandpa really, really well and really strictly and watch things and were careful and let everybody else go about and live their life, catch it, recover, and be fine, they wouldn't have infected the elderly people. This isn't me talking. This is the British Medical Journal, a very respected journal that ran that same model, changed the transmissibility a little bit, changed the death rate a little bit to be more accurate what was known months later, and said this policy killed more people from COVID-19, plus all the kind of deaths we talked about earlier, all the collateral damage from the lockdowns that have nothing to do with death from COVID-19, but will kill people just the same. So it was a very ill-informed decision. And what the British Medical Journal said was interesting is that the policymakers and the scholars didn't run the model to minimize the number of deaths. They ran it to minimize the number of cases. And that was a huge mistake.
Okay. All right. Now, in the main article that has been our focus tonight, COVID-19 Essential Facts, from your website, justfacts.com, you don't address the efficacy of face masks in slowing the spread of COVID-19, but you do address it in another article on your website. There, you began with what you call a question of the day. And the question was, what was the main conclusion of a 2020 CDC review of all gold standard studies that examined the effects of masks on the transmission of the flu in non-healthcare settings? And you offered three choices: masks work, masks don't work, and inconclusive. How have people responded to that thus far? And what's the right answer and why?
So, I mean, people have different views about masks. It's a very contentious and combative issue right now. But this is what this study found. Now, I have to emphasize two things. Number one, this was for the flu. It wasn't for COVID-19. Number two was for non-healthcare settings. These are places in the community, not in a hospital, where someone is fit with an N95 mask and it's got extremely effective sealing around the nose and the face. And the mask, the material itself is very high quality to filter out fine particles. This is the kind of general masking that's going on in schools. And what these gold standard studies found is that the masks were not effective in controlling the spread of the flu. Now, this is the question I asked, the hypothetical. Given that COVID-19 is much more transmissible, so if masks aren't stopping the spread of the flu, how are they going to stop the spread of COVID-19? Now, it is possible. There's a lot of variables here that could affect that finding that might be different for COVID-19. But what people don't understand is that a lot of the studies, all of the studies being currently advertised by the CDC as a reason to mask up are not gold standard studies. They're studies that have definitive flaws that are unacceptable for approving a therapeutic, a medicine. If you came to the FDA and said, I have this medicine and this is the evidence I'm presenting, and it's the study cited by the CDC, they're going to laugh at you and say, no, that is not acceptable level of proof to prove that what you're saying is true. So the CDC is effectively using very weak evidence for its claim that masks are helpful in the community and ignoring the much stronger evidence that's saying otherwise. I'm currently in the midst of researching this much more deeply, but suffice it to say, I think the CDC and a lot of public health officials, World Health Organization, are not leveling with the public about whether or not masks are effective, how certain they are about it. They're just presenting it as this is the way it is, without any of the caveats that should be said when you say this is the way it is. You should be saying this is what this study found. However, it has these very important limitations, and they're not doing that. It's misleading.
Okay.
It's what I talked about earlier. The half a truth amounting to a total lie.
Yeah. You've referred a couple of times to gold standard studies. What is it that makes a study gold standard?
So these would be randomized control trials. So
Okay.
these are where you basically tell somebody, you're going to wear a mask, you're not going to wear a mask, and I'm going to select it randomly, and we're going to see how you do. See, if we go out and we just look at and take a measurement in hindsight and say, well, we looked at these people who wore masks and they were less apt to catch COVID-19. Well, that's fine, but people who wear masks might be more afraid of the disease and be taking other precautions like staying home, not going to work,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it may be. So not a standard where you could approve a medicine for because there's too many other variables. They call it omitted variable bias that make these studies unreliable to draw that definitive conclusion like that. Now, I should
Yeah.
say this. There are certain things that are accepted in science that we don't have randomized control studies for. An example is smoking is bad for you. Okay? It would be considered immoral to tell 1,000 or 10,000 people, you're going to smoke and you're not. And we'll be how you guys turn out. That's the gold standard. But we have so much other evidence showing it's bad for you. You don't do a randomized control randomized control trial in a situation like that. It's considered unethical. But we are nowhere near that with masks. Nowhere, particularly for the situations where they're being used and mandated. And of course, I'm a new resident of Texas. I've just been blown away by how great this state is. And I'm saying it's about 2 months ago, they dropped the mask mandate and the media went crazy. Oh, we're going to have an explosion. And Joe Biden called us Neanderthals and all these other things. And if you look at what's happened in Texas since then, nothing like what they said played out. In fact, the exact opposite has played out. What's COVID-19? Michigan, heavy mask mandate. New Jersey, heavy mask mandate. So that doesn't mean masks don't work. It just means other factors are much stronger. And to say that the masks work in situations like
Mhm.
this, you better step back and say, I need to look at my data and do better before I tell people something with certainty that might not be true.
All right, we've actually gone well beyond our usual hour in this, but I do have a couple more questions for you. That's one of the nice things about a live stream is you have a little flexibility. Um, and again, I guess I'm going to ask you to step out of character again a little bit here. If you had been in charge of America's public policy response to COVID-19, what would you have done? How would that have differed from what has been done? And why would you have done that?
Well,
In 10 seconds or less.
10 seconds, real simple. Everything I've already
Well,
said. I would have done a much better job of protecting the vulnerable and the elderly. I would have let everybody else live their life. And I would have used therapeutics. People who are saying these things don't work, I'm sorry, it's not conclusive. It's not in accordance with what the studies have shown, as best as we can tell. Most of them are not gold standard, a few are. And the bottom line is, if you start therapeutics early, they're not a miracle cure, but they help reduce fatality and the effects of this disease. Those are the three things I would have done.
I was joking about 10 seconds, but you just about did it.
It was
Well,
like 15. I tried.
okay. What would you advise as the wisest course going forward with COVID-19, granted that we have done so much wrong so far? What should we be doing now?
Believe it or not, that's a little bit of a tougher question. Because we have the vaccine, it may make sense for some places that have locked down thus far to lock down until they can get enough people vaccinated to develop herd immunity. That's going to be a very difficult calculation. You'd have to look at each place in particular. I think it's going to be different. If it's a country where 1% of people are immunized, prospects for immunization are low, I would do what I said earlier. I'd protect the vulnerable by let everybody else go out and live their lives.
And you would, in some circumstances where they've had the lockdowns a lot, you would suggest that the lockdowns maybe continue while the number of vaccines ramps up, the number of vaccinated people. And I'm thinking about, why would that be the case? Would it be because since the lockdowns have been there, we haven't built up anywhere near as close to herd immunity as places that didn't have the lockdowns? So we now need to
Correct.
make up for that by spreading the vaccines around more widely?
Yeah, I mean, if you've gone this far, a year plus with these lockdowns, the damage has been done. And if you're maybe can get a large portion of your population vaccinated in a month or two, it might make sense to wait them out. I mean, this is very, very different for each case. It would depend how many people have already have natural immunity, but it may make sense to wait a little while longer if you've already locked down aggressively. Let's take
Okay.
Japan or a nation like that where they're already went through this with these lockdowns. Why give up at the last second? You've already done the damage. So why multiply that when the solution is right around the corner?
Okay. All right. Well, Jim, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This has been educational for me. I hope it has been for all of our viewers. I'm sure it will have been. Do you have any just concluding comments for us, including telling people how they can go to Just Facts and support you?
Sure. So first of all, thank you. This was a great conversation. Your questions were phenomenal. I appreciate you giving me a platform to share these facts with people. And facts matter. I mean, if people make decisions, as we've seen, with bad information, they can kill people. And this is a prime example of such a case. So yeah, our website is justfacts.com. We're a nonprofit. Appreciate the support of anyone who feels led to do that. But I encourage you to donate to the Cornwall Alliance. They do phenomenal work, and they are a cause worthy of your support. And just really appreciate what you do. And thank you for having me. It's been great.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim, so very, very much for joining us tonight. And I would encourage all of you to go to justfacts.com. It's a tremendous site. There are articles on many different subjects there. All of them are as carefully researched as this one on COVID-19. And I think that you will always find really reliable information there. It's certainly a go-to place for me. Thank you again for joining us this evening. I would remind you that for the month of May, when you make a donation to the Cornwall Alliance of literally any size and ask for it, we will gladly send you Fix America's Forests. This is a marvelous study on the actual causes of the recent increase in wildfires around the United States, especially the western states, as opposed to the claimed cause of global warming, and talking about what we can do to tamp these down. This is a wonderful study, and the two authors of that, Holly Fretwell and Jonathan Wood of the Property and Environment Research Center, will be our guests next week on From the Stacks. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just write in promo code 21-05 or Fix America's Forests, and we'll be glad to send that to you. Again, thank you for joining us this evening. Come again next week and learn how to fix America's forests.